The snow fell softly on the morning of December 16, 1944, drifting through the skeletal fingers of the Ardennes forest like a gentle benediction. American soldiers huddled in their foxholes along an 85-mile front, wrapped in wool and uncertainty, their breath clouding the frozen air. They were young men, most of them, farm boys from Kansas and factory workers from Pennsylvania, students who had left their textbooks behind to carry rifles instead. They wrote letters home by candlelight, speaking of Christmas and hoping the war might end before spring. They did not know that in 4 minutes, their world would be torn apart by the throat of hell itself. At 5:30 a.m., the earth screamed. 4,752 German shells fell in 4 minutes. Not scattered, not random, a calculated tempest of steel and flame that erupted across the American lines with surgical precision. Trees that had stood for centuries exploded into splinters, their trunks shattered by the concussive force of high explosive. Men vanished into mist, not killed, but erased, their bodies scattered across the snow in pieces too small to gather. The ground itself seemed to convulse, rejecting the violence thrust upon it, heaving upward in great fountains of frozen earth and rock. Foxholes collapsed, burying men alive. Command posts disappeared in single impacts. Communication lines were severed in the first 30 seconds. In those 4 minutes, the Wehrmacht announced its last great gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine, with the oldest language of war, thunder and death. The surprise was total. Intelligence had failed. Weather had grounded reconnaissance planes. And now, in the gray dawn of a Belgian winter, 21 German divisions were pouring through the fog and snow, their tanks grinding forward through the forests, their infantry moving like wolves through terrain the Americans had thought impassable. It was the largest German offensive since 1940, the final throw of the dice by a regime that had already lost the war but refused to accept defeat. Adolf Hitler himself had planned it, gambling everything on the desperate hope that one more victory, one more breakthrough, might split the Allied armies and buy Germany time to survive. But Germany had awoken something it could not comprehend. Something forged not in the traditions of Prussian military academies, but in the furnaces of Detroit, the drawing boards of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the blood-soaked lessons of 3 years of industrial warfare. The American Artillery Corps was no longer simply an arm of the military. It had become a mathematical apocalypse, a symphony of destruction conducted by slide rules and radar, powered by an industrial machine that could not be stopped, would not be silenced, and had learned to kill with a precision that made the gods themselves flinch. The Germans had numbers. They had experience. They had desperation that comes from knowing your homeland is being bombed to rubble, that Soviet armies are closing from the east, that surrender means occupation and trial and the end of everything you have fought for. But the Americans had something more terrifying. They had made artillery into a science. Long before the first shells fell in the Ardennes, a revolution had been quietly unfolding in the American way of war. It had begun in the deserts of North Africa, where American gunners had learned painful lessons against Rommel's Afrika Korps. It had continued through Sicily and Italy, where every mountain pass had become a classroom written in blood. And it had reached its apotheosis in France, where American artillery had perfected techniques that would have seemed like magic to the gunners of the First World War. While German artillery officers still relied on methods perfected in the trenches of Verdun and the Somme, American gunners had embraced something radical. The belief that mathematics could be weaponized, that calculus could kill more efficiently than courage, that the future of warfare belonged not to the bravest but to the most precise. They had studied trajectory tables with the dedication of rabbinical scholars. They had practiced radio procedures until forward observers could call down fire in their sleep. They had drilled, trained, calculated, and prepared for a kind of warfare that had never existed before. They called it time on target. The doctrine was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Instead of batteries firing in sequence, creating a rolling barrage that warned the enemy of what was coming, that gave them precious seconds to take cover, American gunners calculated the exact trajectory, the precise flight time, the perfect moment, so that every shell, from every gun, from every battery across miles of front, would arrive at the same heartbeat. One instant of peace, the next, annihilation. No warning. No escape. Just the sudden, total erasure of everything within the kill zone. Imagine it from the perspective of a German soldier. You are crouched in a trench, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon for threats. The morning is quiet except for the distant rumble of engines, the occasional crack of small arms fire. There is no warning whistle, no preliminary bombardment, nothing to suggest that death is hurtling toward you through the sky. Then, in one frozen moment, the world ends. Not in stages, not in waves, but all at once. 50 shells, 100 shells, arriving in the same instant, detonating within a fraction of a second of each other. The air becomes fire. The earth becomes shrapnel. There is no time to scream, no time to pray, no time to think anything at all except that existence itself has become pain and noise and the absolute certainty that this is the end. To achieve this required tools the world had never seen. The Americans developed firing tables of staggering complexity. Books thick as Bibles filled with columns of numbers that accounted for wind speed, air density, barrel wear, propellant temperature, the rotation of the earth itself. These were not approximations or rough estimates. They were mathematical certainties, calculated to 3 decimal places, tested and refined through thousands of practice missions. Each type of shell, each type of gun, each possible combination of charge and elevation, all of it documented, tabulated, made ready for the moment when seconds would mean the difference between life and death. Forward observers carried radio sets that could call down fire in minutes rather than hours. These were men who crept through enemy territory, who climbed church steeples and water towers, who hid in haystacks and barns with binoculars and maps, calculating ranges and bearings while German soldiers walked past just meters away. They were the eyes of the artillery, the men who could see what needed to die and had the training to make it happen. Their radio calls were terse, precise, almost poetic in their efficiency. Fire mission, grid coordinates Baker 7903, enemy infantry in the open, request high explosive, quick fuse. And miles away, men would consult their tables, adjust their sights, and send death flying through the sky. Fire direction centers became temples of calculation, where young men with slide rules and plotting boards solved differential equations while the shells screamed overhead. These were mathematicians turned warriors, engineers who could compute firing solutions faster than most men could read them. They worked in bunkers and tents, hunched over maps by the light of kerosene lamps, converting coordinates into killing data with a speed and accuracy that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The Germans had good artillery officers. The Americans had men who could calculate the trajectory of death to the nearest meter, who could adjust for a crosswind at 10,000 feet, who could factor in the temperature of the propellant and the wear on the barrel rifling and still deliver a shell to within 50 yards of where they wanted it to land. And behind it all, the industrial colossus stirred. In the sprawling factories of America, in Michigan and Pennsylvania, in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, the machinery of democracy had been retooled for a singular purpose. Assembly lines that had once produced automobiles now birthed instruments of war with the same relentless efficiency. Chrysler plants that had built sedans and coupes now manufactured artillery shells by the millions, their production lines running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, never stopping, never slowing, feeding a war machine that stretched across oceans and continents. Ford factories stamped out shell casings in a rhythm that never ceased, each one inspected, tested, packed into crates and loaded onto ships that formed convoys stretching from horizon to horizon. General Electric wound miles of copper wire into the guts of proximity fuses. Tiny miracles of engineering no larger than a man's fist, yet containing vacuum tubes and batteries and miniature radar sets that could sense the presence of the ground and detonate at the perfect height to maximize carnage. These fuses were so secret, so revolutionary, that they were initially forbidden for use over land for fear that the Germans might recover one intact and copy the design. Each fuse represented dozens of hours of skilled labor, thousands of dollars in components, and a level of technological sophistication that the Germans could barely comprehend, let alone replicate. The production numbers became almost meaningless in their enormity. By the end of 1944, American factories were producing more than 10 million artillery shells per month. Tens of millions of shells, hundreds of millions of pounds of high explosive, thousands of tons of brass and steel and copper, entire mountains of ammunition stacked at depots across France, organized by caliber and fuse type, ready to be loaded onto trucks and transported to the guns. The logistics required to sustain this river of steel were staggering. Ships had to be built to carry it. Railroads had to be expanded to distribute it. Warehouses had to be constructed to store it. But America had the wealth, the industry, the raw materials, and most crucially, the distance from the fighting to make it all happen. The Germans could count their shells. They knew exactly how many rounds each battery had, how many more might be scraped together from rear area depots, how long they could sustain fire before the ammunition ran out. The Americans had stopped counting. They fired not with the careful parsimony of a nation running out of resources, but with the profligate abundance of an empire at the height of its power. If a forward observer called for 100 rounds, he got 100 rounds. If he needed 1,000, the guns would fire until their barrels glowed red and the ground beneath them was littered with spent brass. The guns themselves became legends whispered in the darkness, given names and personalities by the men who served them. The M1 155mm howitzer was the workhorse of American artillery. Ugly, reliable, capable of firing 4 rounds per minute and landing them in a circle 50 yards wide at 15 miles. Its shells weighed 95 pounds, enough to demolish a building or crater a road or kill everyone in a trench with a single direct hit. Thousands of these howitzers served in Europe, their crews working with the mechanical efficiency of men who had performed the same sequence of movements 10,000 times. Swab the barrel, load the shell, load the charge, close the breech, pull the lanyard, watch the gun buck backward against its spade. Then do it again and again until the fire mission was complete or the barrel wore out, whichever came first. But it was the heavy guns that truly captured the imagination and terror of those who witnessed them. The M1 240mm howitzer, called Black Eva by the men who served her, was a monster that required a crew of 14 and a tractor to move. Her shells weighed 360 pounds, as much as 2 grown men, and when they landed, they created craters deep enough to swallow a truck. Black Eva could punch through 6 feet of reinforced concrete, could obliterate a bunker designed to withstand anything less than a direct hit from a battleship. Her voice was the voice of apocalypse, a sound so deep and powerful that it was felt as much as heard, a pressure wave that compressed the air and made men's lungs ache even miles away. And then there was the Long Tom, the M1 155mm gun, distinguished from the howitzer by its longer barrel and flatter trajectory. The Long Tom could reach nearly 15 miles, hurling a 100-pound shell across the horizon with enough velocity to punch through armor plate. Its crack and roar split the sky, a sound that was not merely loud but physically painful, that left men deaf for hours after a firing mission. German soldiers learned to fear the Long Tom above all other weapons, because its range meant that it could reach them anywhere, that there was no safe distance, no rear area secure from its reach. Command posts were destroyed while German officers bent over their maps. Supply depots erupted in flames miles behind the front. Artillery batteries firing their own missions were annihilated before they could displace, hit by counter-battery fire guided by radar and mathematics and the cold calculation of men who had mastered the geometry of death. But it was the calliope that brought nightmares to life, that introduced a new dimension of horror to the battlefield. These were rocket launchers mounted on the backs of Sherman tanks, 60 tubes of 4.5-inch rockets, each one a cylinder of explosive propellant wrapped around a warhead, crude and inaccurate compared to conventional artillery but devastating in their psychological impact. When a calliope fired, the sky itself seemed to tear open. Rippling waves of fire and smoke, each rocket trailing a bright scar across the darkness, falling like the wrath of an angry god upon anything below. The sound was not thunder. It was something more primal, more terrible, the howl of a beast that could not be killed, could not be reasoned with, would not stop until everything burned. The rockets were wildly inaccurate by artillery standards. A single rocket might land anywhere within 100 yards of its aim point. But a calliope fired 60 rockets in a matter of seconds, saturating an area the size of a football field with high explosive and white phosphorus. Buildings collapsed.
Vehicles overturnat.
Men caught in the open were shredded by shrapnel or immolated by phosphorus that burned at thousands of degrees and could not be extinguished with water. The Germans called the calliope the Screaming Mimi, and they were not wrong. It screamed as it flew, screamed as it landed, and left its victims screaming if they survived at all. And in the opening days of the Bulge, as German panzers pushed through the snow and fog, smashing through scattered American units that fought with desperate courage but lacked the numbers and equipment to hold. It seemed for a moment that the old ways might triumph. That steel and courage and desperate fury could still overwhelm calculation and industry. The Wehrmacht advanced 30 miles in 3 days, deeper than anyone had thought possible. They overran entire battalions, captured supply depots filled with gasoline and ammunition, pushed toward the Meuse River and the dream of splitting the Allied armies in half. They surrounded Bastogne, a critical road junction held by the 101st Airborne and elements of other units. Men who had been resting, refitting, expecting to spend Christmas away from the fighting. Instead they found themselves encircled, outnumbered, running low on ammunition and medical supplies, with German tanks prowling just beyond the perimeter. The Germans demanded surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe, commander of the defenders, sent back a one-word reply that would become legend: nuts. And the men of Bastogne dug in, determined to hold until relief arrived or death claimed them, whichever came first. But even as the Germans pushed forward, even as their advance seemed unstoppable, the American artillery was shifting, calculating, preparing. Across hundreds of miles of front, batteries were displacing, moving to new positions, registering their guns on pre-planned targets. Fire direction centers were coordinating with infantry and armor commanders, plotting lines of fire, establishing communications networks. And most critically, the shells were flowing forward, truck convoys grinding through the snow, delivering ammunition by the ton to gun positions that would soon become the most active real estate on Earth. The counter-battery fire came first, systematic and merciless. New radar systems, the SCR-584 and its siblings, could track German shells in flight, plot their trajectory, and calculate their origin point in seconds. These radars were marvels of engineering, using wavelengths of radio energy to paint electronic pictures of the battlefield, to see things that were invisible to human eyes. They could detect a shell within moments of it leaving the barrel, track its arc across the sky, and reduce its launch point to a set of coordinates that could be radioed to American guns before the German crews even thought about moving. It was warfare at the speed of light, guided by invisible fingers of radiation. German batteries would fire their missions, devastating American positions with the same brutal efficiency they had demonstrated for 4 years of war. But within 2 minutes, within 3 minutes, American shells would begin landing exactly where those batteries had stood. Not nearby. Not in the general area. Exactly. Gun crews were obliterated at their posts, killed by shell fragments moving at supersonic speeds before they could even comprehend that they had been targeted. Ammunition dumps erupted in chains of sympathetic detonations that could be seen for miles, fireballs climbing into the winter sky, shock waves flattening everything for hundreds of yards. Tractors and trucks burned. The wounded screamed for medics who were themselves among the casualties. The Germans learned to fire and flee, to execute a single fire mission and then abandon their position as quickly as their vehicles could carry them. But even this was not enough. American forward observers were everywhere, hidden in tree lines and farmhouses, riding in jeeps and light tanks, calling down fire on any movement they spotted. German gun crews found themselves choosing between 2 forms of death: stay in position and be destroyed by counter-battery fire, or move and be caught in the open by time on target bombardments that gave no warning and no mercy. The mathematics of it were elegant and terrible. A German battery might fire 10 shells before displacing. An American battery responding to the same target would fire 50, 100, until the fire direction center was satisfied that nothing living remained in the kill zone. It was not bravery or skill that decided these duels, but simple arithmetic. The side with more shells, more guns, and better targeting systems would win. And the Americans had all 3 advantages. But the true horror, the moment when the myth of German invincibility finally shattered beyond repair, came when General George Patton turned the Third Army north. Patton had been driving his army toward the German frontier, pushing through Lorraine with his characteristic aggression, when word came of the German offensive. His superiors asked if he could disengage, will 90 degrees, and counterattack into the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton, with the confidence of a man who had been planning for exactly this contingency, told them he could attack in 48 hours. It seemed impossible. To disengage an entire army in contact with the enemy, to move 250,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles 90 degrees across winter roads, to coordinate logistics and communications and fire support for a counterattack that would have to succeed or risk losing the entire campaign. It was the kind of operation that military theorists said required weeks of preparation. Patton did it in 2 days. The movement was a miracle of logistics, executed by men who worked through the night in temperatures well below freezing, guiding convoys through narrow roads already clogged with refugees and retreating units. Gasoline trucks moved in endless chains. Artillery battalions displaced en masse, their guns limbered up and towed through the darkness by tractors that sometimes slipped off icy roads and had to be winched back up by their crews. Ammunition trucks ground forward in low gear, their drivers fighting sleep and cold and the very real possibility that they might take a wrong turn and end up in German-held territory. And when Patton's army arrived, when his leading elements began to make contact with the German forces besieging Bastogne, his artillery spoke with a voice that would be remembered for generations. On December 22nd, in the frozen fields around Bastogne, the American artillery unleashed a barrage that defied description. Battery after battery, battalion after battalion, every gun within range opened fire in a coordinated symphony of destruction. This was time on target taken to its logical, horrifying extreme. Fire direction centers across miles of front had coordinated their missions with the precision of orchestra conductors, calculating the flight times of shells from different calibers and different ranges so that they would all arrive in the same instant. The mathematics were perfect. The timing was flawless. And for the German soldiers caught in the open, caught in their assembly areas and supply points and command posts, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no prayer that could be heard over the endless, merciless thunder. The shells fell like rain that day. Rain made of steel and high explosive. Rain that cratered the earth and splintered trees and turned living human beings into scattered pieces of meat. The ground erupted in geysers of frozen earth and shattered rock, fountains of destruction that rose 50 feet into the air and fell back down as deadly hail. Men were thrown through the air like rag dolls, their bodies broken by concussion even when shrapnel missed them. Tanks were flipped onto their backs by near misses, their crews cooked alive inside metal shells that became ovens as ammunition fires spread through the interior. The concussion alone could kill. Ruptured lungs, shattered eardrums, brains hemorrhaging inside skulls that looked intact from the outside but contained only jelly within. And still the shells came, wave after wave after wave, an industrial killing machine that fed on its own momentum, that grew more efficient with every fire mission, that never tired, never faltered, never showed mercy. American gunners fired until their shoulders were bruised from the recoil, until their ears bled from the concussion, until the barrels of their guns were so hot they had to be swabbed with water between rounds to prevent cook-offs. They fired until the ground around their positions was carpeted with spent brass casings, until the ammunition trucks arrived with fresh supplies and they immediately began firing those as well. The German command structure began to disintegrate under the weight of this bombardment. Radio communications were severed when command posts took direct hits. Runners sent with messages never arrived, killed by shells or lost in the chaos, or simply unable to find their destinations in a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Units became isolated, cut off from orders and supply, left to fight or flee or surrender based on the judgment of junior officers who had never expected to command anything larger than a platoon. German prisoners, when they could be found, when they could speak, when they had recovered enough from the shock to form coherent sentences, described it in terms that belonged to theology rather than warfare. They spoke of the end of the world, of Ragnarok and Armageddon, of divine judgment rendered not by angels but by machines. They spoke of the sound, not loud in the simple sense, but overwhelming, all-consuming, a physical presence that invaded every cell of your body. A sound that did not merely echo but lived inside your chest, inside your bones. A vibration that made your teeth ache and your heart forget its rhythm, that continued even after the shelling stopped, ringing in your ears and pulsing in your blood for hours and days afterward. Some prisoners spoke of men who simply stopped, sat down in the snow, and waited for death because the fear had become too much to carry, because the human mind was never designed to endure such sustained terror and had chosen to shut down rather than continue processing the horror. Others described soldiers who fled their posts not out of cowardice but out of a primitive survival instinct that overrode training and discipline and duty, Men who ran until they collapsed from exhaustion or were cut down by their own officers trying to restore order. The psychological dimension of American artillery was, perhaps, its most devastating weapon. In the trenches of World War I, soldiers could see the enemy across no man's land, could fire back, could feel some sense of agency in their own survival. Even in the tank battles and infantry assaults of World War II, there was a human element. You could shoot back, take cover, maneuver, do something to influence your fate. But artillery rendered men helpless in a way that nothing else could. Death came from the sky, guided by men you would never see, unleashed by calculations performed miles away by officers consulting tables and charts. You could be brave, skilled, experienced, it did not matter. A shell cared nothing for courage. It killed the hero and the coward with equal indifference, the veteran and the recruit, the officer and the private. Rank and medals and years of service meant nothing to high explosive. And the Americans had mastered the art of ensuring that every soldier in every German unit knew, with absolute certainty, that death could find them at any moment. Forward observers infiltrated behind enemy lines, moving through forests and fields in the darkness, calling down fire on supply convoys that thought they were safely beyond artillery range, on headquarters buildings marked with flags and radio antennas, on rest areas where exhausted soldiers tried to catch a few hours of sleep. Spotter planes circled overhead during daylight hours, their pilots marking targets with colored smoke, transforming the battlefield into a grid of calculated kill zones where nothing larger than a rabbit could move without being observed and targeted. Even the darkness offered no refuge. American guns fired by starlight, by compass bearing, by cold mathematical certainty that transcended human vision. Fire missions were executed at midnight, at 3 in the morning, at dawn. Times when soldiers traditionally felt safe enough to sleep, to eat a hot meal, to write a letter home. The Americans ensured that there was never a safe time, never a safe place, that the artillery could reach out and touch you anywhere, anytime, for any reason or no reason at all. The guns themselves became more than weapons to the men who served them. They were companions, tools, almost living things that required constant care and feeding. Crews gave their guns names, Big Bertha and Thor's Hammer and Sweet Caroline, and spoke to them as if they could hear, as if they had personalities and preferences. After weeks of continuous firing, gunners could tell when their weapon was having a bad day, when the barrel was worn and the shells were landing long, when the recoil mechanism needed adjustment or the trails needed to be redug into soil that had been churned to mud by repeated firing. There was an intimacy to the work of artillery, a rhythmic quality that became almost meditative despite the violence it produced. Swab the barrel. Load the shell carefully because 100 pounds of high explosive deserves respect. Load the bag charges, white, green, or red depending on the range required. Close the breech with a solid clank that meant everything was locked and ready. Check the sight. Make minute adjustments for wind and temperature. Wait for the fire command. Pull the lanyard. Feel the gun leap backward like a living thing. Watch the shell arc away into the sky, a dark blur that disappeared in an instant. Then do it again, and again, and again, until your world narrowed to nothing but the gun and the sequence and the knowledge that somewhere, miles away, your shells were ending lives and destroying dreams and remaking the landscape into something unrecognizable. The American artillerymen who served in the Bulge fired more shells in December 1944 than the entire American Expeditionary Force had fired in all of World War I. Let that sink in, more in 1 month than in an entire previous war. The numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. Individual batteries fired thousands of rounds. Battalions fired tens of thousands. Corps-level artillery commands coordinated fire missions involving hundreds of guns and hundreds of thousands of shells. The logistics required to sustain this rate of fire were mind-boggling. Every shell had to be transported from a port in France or Belgium, loaded onto trucks, driven to ammunition dumps, sorted and stored, then loaded onto trucks again and delivered to gun positions. The brass casings had to be collected and sent back for recycling. The worn-out barrels had to be replaced. The exhausted crews had to be rotated out and replaced with fresh men. But the machine kept running, kept feeding shells into guns that kept firing, because that was what America did best. Sustained industrial violence on a scale that no other nation could match. The Soviet Union could field more men. Germany could produce tanks that were technically superior. Britain had experience and grit and the memory of standing alone against fascism. But America had factories, resources, and the institutional knowledge of how to transform raw materials into weapons and deploy them across an ocean with devastating efficiency. By Christmas Day, the tide had turned. Not through any single decisive battle, though there were many fierce engagements. Not through heroic charges or brilliant tactical maneuvers, though there were plenty of both. The tide turned through the accumulated weight of 10,000 fire missions, 1,000,000 shells, 2,000,000 shells, the inexorable grinding of an industrial power that could replace its losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. German units, battered and demoralized and running desperately low on fuel and ammunition, began to pull back. Some fought with the desperate ferocity of men who knew they were already dead, who chose to die with rifles in their hands rather than surrender. Others simply melted away into the forest, abandoning their vehicles when the fuel ran out, abandoning their weapons when the ammunition was expended, abandoning even their wounded when the capacity to help them was gone. Anything to escape the endless thunder that followed them like the wrath of an angry god. The relief of Bastogne came on December 26th, when Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German perimeter. The siege had lasted 10 days. The defenders had been cold, hungry, short on ammunition and medical supplies. But they had held, and they had been aided throughout by American artillery firing from outside the encirclement, shells arcing over the heads of the defenders to land on German positions with relentless precision. When the first American tanks rolled into Bastogne, they found a town that barely existed anymore. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets cratered and impassable, the dead lying in frozen piles because there was no way to bury them in ground frozen solid. But they also found men who were still fighting, still defiant, still certain that their artillery would keep them alive until relief arrived. And they had been right. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month, slowly, gradually, as American forces compressed the German salient and pushed the Wehrmacht back to its starting positions. But the outcome was decided in those first terrible weeks, decided not by generalship alone but by the simple, brutal calculus of firepower. The Germans had launched their offensive with a finite supply of shells, a limited number of guns, and no realistic hope of replacement. Every shell they fired brought them closer to the moment when their guns would fall silent. Every gun they lost was gone forever, unable to be replaced by factories that were being bombed around the clock by Allied aircraft. The Americans had launched their counterattack with the knowledge that every shell they fired would be replaced by 10 more, that every gun destroyed would be substituted by sunrise, that the factories back home were running 3 shifts a day and would continue running until the war was won or the world ended, whichever came first. This wasn't warfare in the traditional sense, it was industrial competition, a contest to see which side could sustain violence longer, and the outcome was never really in doubt. In the end, more than 100,000 German casualties were attributed to American artillery. Not killed by men they could see, could fight, could hate with the personal intensity that comes from looking into another human being's eyes. Killed by mathematics. Killed by industry. Killed by slide rules and firing tables and radar sets and the carefully calculated trajectory of steel falling from the sky. Some died instantly, obliterated by direct hits that left nothing to identify or mourn. Others died slowly, bleeding out in the snow from shrapnel wounds that no medic could reach in time. Still others survived physically but were broken mentally, reduced to trembling wrecks who flinched at every sound and could not be convinced that the shelling had stopped, that they were safe, that the thunder had finally ended. But there was a cost that could not be measured in tons of steel or gallons of blood, a cost that would only become apparent in the years and decades after the war ended. The American artillerymen who served those guns, who pulled those lanyards, who sent those shells screaming into the darkness. They paid a price that would echo through their lives and into their dreams. Some spoke, years later, of the numbness that came from killing men you never saw, the abstract horror of coordinates and map grids standing in for human beings. They had killed thousands, tens of thousands perhaps, and never once looked into the face of their victims. Never heard their voices or learned their names or knew whether they had families waiting for them to come home. This distance, this abstraction, made it easier in some ways. You could convince yourself that you were just doing a job, following orders, that the men you killed were not really men but targets, problems to be solved with the correct application of mathematics and high explosive. But in other ways, it made it worse. At least an infantryman who killed with a rifle could tell himself that it was self-defense, kill or be killed, that the man who died had been trying to kill him first. An artilleryman had no such comfort. The men he killed might have been sleeping or eating breakfast or reading a letter from home when the shells arrived. They posed no immediate threat. They had no chance to surrender. They simply ceased to exist because someone miles away had calculated that they needed to die. Some artillerymen carried this weight in silence, letting the thunder live on in their dreams, waking in the night to the phantom sound of shells screaming overhead. Others turned to alcohol or work or religion, searching for something that might fill the emptiness or justify what they had done. A very few, spoke openly about it in veterans' halls and therapy sessions and late-night conversations with other men who had served, trying to make sense of what it meant to have become so efficient at killing, to have transformed violence into a science and science into annihilation. And the thunder did live on, far beyond the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes. The lessons learned in the Bulge, the doctrine of time on target, the marriage of mathematics and mass destruction, the integration of radar and communications and forward observers into a single killing system, these became the foundation of modern artillery warfare, copied and refined by armies around the world. In Korea, American guns would fire with the same terrible precision, stopping human wave attacks with barrages that killed by the thousands. In Vietnam, fire bases would coordinate artillery support that could be called down within minutes of contact, turning the jungle into a killing ground where North Vietnamese soldiers learned to fear the American guns even more than they feared napalm or bombs. And even now, in an age of GPS and satellite guidance, of drones that can watch individual targets from 60,000 feet and precision munitions that can fly through a specific window, the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Modern artillery has become even more accurate, even more lethal, capable of delivering death to within meters of the desired aim point. Multiple launch rocket systems can saturate areas the size of several football fields in seconds. Guided shells can adjust their trajectory in flight, correcting for wind and weather, ensuring that they land exactly where they are needed. The technology has evolved, but the philosophy remains the same. That wars are won not by the bravest soldiers, but by the side that can deliver more violence, more accurately, more efficiently, to more places, more quickly than the enemy can respond. The artillery of World War II did not merely win battles. It transformed the philosophy of warfare itself, proving beyond any doubt that industrial power, married to scientific method and executed with ruthless efficiency, could overcome any advantage of terrain, training, or tradition. It demonstrated that in modern war, the greatest weapon is not courage or skill or tactical brilliance, but the capacity to sustain violence at a scale and intensity that breaks the enemy's will to resist. It showed that the nation with the better factories, the better logistics, the better mathematics would win, not might win, but would win as inevitably as gravity pulls a shell back to Earth. The German military of 1944 was still, in many ways, one of the finest fighting forces ever assembled. Their soldiers were well-trained, experienced, motivated by the defense of their homeland. Their officers understood tactics and operational art at a level that few armies could match. Their equipment, when they had it, was often superior to what the Allies fielded. But none of it mattered against an enemy that could bring 10 shells to bear for every one they fired, that could sustain bombardments for hours while German guns fell silent after minutes, that could replace losses overnight while German factories burned under Allied bombs. The strategic implications were profound and would reshape military thinking for generations. The Battle of the Bulge proved that in modern warfare, firepower could substitute for manpower, that a relatively small force with overwhelming artillery support could defeat a much larger force that lacked it. This realization would drive military doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The Soviet Union would build its entire operational concept around massive artillery preparation. NATO would develop the concept of the deep battle, using artillery to strike not just the front lines but command posts and supply lines deep in enemy territory. Even insurgent forces and guerrilla movements would come to understand that the key to defeating a modern army was not to match it in firepower, but to avoid its artillery entirely, to fight in cities where shells could not be used without killing civilians, in mountains where observers could not see, in conditions where the awesome machinery of destruction could not be brought to bear. The economic dimension of the artillery war in the Bulge is equally worth contemplating. Each 155mm shell cost approximately $45 in 1944 currency. roughly $700 in today's money when adjusted for inflation. The Americans fired millions of these shells in the Ardennes campaign alone. The cost, in purely financial terms, was staggering billions of dollars worth of ammunition expended in a single month. But America could afford it. The United States economy in 1944 was producing nearly half of all the world's manufactured goods, and a significant portion of that production was dedicated to feeding the war machine. The Germans, by contrast, were rationing shells, conserving ammunition, making agonizing decisions about where to concentrate their limited fire support. They were fighting a rich man's war with a poor man's resources, and the outcome was never in doubt. There is something almost tragic in the German experience of the Bulge, a kind of Wagnerian doom that seems fitting for a nation that had always romanticized the concept of heroic defeat. The soldiers who launched that offensive on December 16th were not cowards or criminals. Most of them were simply men defending their country against invasion, motivated by the same patriotic impulses that drove American and British soldiers to fight. They advanced into Belgium with courage and determination, achieving tactical surprise and initial success against veteran American units. For a few brief days, they must have believed that victory was possible, that one more push might turn the tide. But they were fighting against mathematics, against logistics, against an industrial system that had been perfected over 3 years of total war. They were trying to win with bravery and skill against an enemy that had learned to win with steel and calculation. And as the shells began to fall, as American artillery found its range and began to systematically destroy every German concentration, every supply dump, every command post, the dream of victory must have died in their hearts long before their bodies fell in the snow. The weather played its own cruel role in the drama of the Bulge. The offensive had been launched during a period of fog and low clouds that grounded Allied aircraft, denying the Americans one of their key advantages. But the weather could not stop the artillery. Shells did not need clear skies or good visibility. They flew through fog and snow and darkness, guided by mathematics that cared nothing for meteorology. German soldiers who had survived the cauldrons of Stalingrad and Normandy found themselves experiencing a new form of helplessness. Pinned down by artillery they could not see, directed by observers they could not locate, coming from guns that were beyond the range of any weapon they possessed. When the weather finally cleared and Allied aircraft returned to the skies, the slaughter intensified. Fighter bombers worked in coordination with artillery, with forward observers directing both airstrikes and shell fire onto the same targets. German columns caught in the open found themselves attacked from above by P-47 Thunderbolts dropping bombs and firing rockets, while simultaneously being bracketed by artillery shells that made evasion impossible.
Vehicles burnat.
Men died by the hundreds, and still the shells came, never stopping, never slowing, a mechanical rain of death that seemed to have no end. The American soldiers who witnessed this devastation, who walked through the aftermath of major artillery barrages, struggled to process what they saw. The human body is not designed to withstand the forces generated by high explosive. What they found in the impact zones was often not recognizable as having once been human. Trees were stripped of their bark and branches, reduced to white splinters that stood like skeletal fingers against the sky. The earth itself was churned and mixed with the fragments of what had once been men. A boot with a foot still in it, a helmet with a skull inside, things that had been people reduced to components scattered across a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Some American soldiers felt pity for their enemies, seeing in the broken German bodies the reflection of what might have been their own fate if circumstances had been different. Others felt a grim satisfaction, knowing that every German killed by artillery was one less enemy they would have to face with a rifle. Most felt some combination of both, relief that it was the enemy who had died rather than themselves, mixed with a queasy awareness that this kind of killing, this industrial annihilation, was something fundamentally different from the clean combat of their imaginations. The chaplains who served with American artillery units faced theological questions that had no easy answers. How do you comfort a man who has just fired shells that killed dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people he never saw? How do you reconcile the commandment against killing with the military necessity of your mission? How do you maintain the humanity of your soldiers when their job requires them to become components in a killing machine? Some chaplains preach sermons about just war and the defense of freedom, trying to frame the killing in moral terms that made it bearable. Others simply offered presence and listening, letting men talk about what they had done and how it made them feel, without judgment or platitudes. The sound of the artillery barrage became, in many ways, the signature of the American way of war, not the sharp crack of rifle fire or the chatter of machine guns, but the deep, rolling thunder of mass guns firing in coordination. It was a sound that announced American presence, that promised victory to friendly forces and threatened annihilation to enemies. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound of American artillery and to distinguish it from their own, heavier, more sustained, coming from more guns in more directions, seemingly inexhaustible. Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front, who had their own formidable artillery, were nevertheless impressed by reports of American fire support in the West. The Japanese, fighting their own desperate defensive battles in the Pacific, came to dread the steel rain that preceded every American assault. In the final accounting of the Battle of the Bulge, the casualties tell a stark story. American losses were approximately 19,000 killed, 62,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. Terrible numbers that represented real people, real families destroyed, real futures snuffed out. But German losses were far worse, somewhere between 80 and 100,000 total casualties, including at least 12,000 killed. And of those casualties, the largest single category was attributed to artillery fire. Not small arms, not armor, not aircraft, artillery. The mathematical, industrial, impersonal delivery of high explosive onto target coordinates. The German military never recovered from the losses sustained in the Bulge. The panzer divisions that had been husbanded for the offensive, that represented Germany's last mobile reserve, were destroyed or so badly mauled that they ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. The artillery that had been concentrated for the attack was systematically annihilated by American counter-battery fire. The ammunition that had been stockpiled was expended in the first days of fighting, and there was no realistic prospect of replacement. When the Wehrmacht fell back to its starting positions in mid-January 1945, it was a spent force, capable only of fighting delaying actions against the Allied armies that would soon cross the Rhine and drive into the heart of Germany. The Americans, by contrast, emerged from the Bulge bloodied but stronger. Yes, they had taken casualties. Yes, some units had been overrun or forced to surrender. But the industrial machine that supported them had never wavered. Ammunition stocks were replenished within days. Damaged guns were replaced. Fresh units were brought up from reserve. And the artillery kept firing, kept improving its techniques, kept refining the deadly science that had proven so devastatingly effective. There is a museum in Bastogne today, dedicated to the memory of the battle. Visitors can walk through recreations of foxholes and command posts, can see the equipment and weapons that were used, can read the letters and diaries of men who fought there. But no museum can truly convey the sound, the physical, overwhelming presence of massed artillery fire that made the earth tremble and the air itself seem solid with noise. No display of shell casings, no matter how artfully arranged, can communicate the industrial scale of the bombardment, the sheer quantity of steel that fell from the sky. No recorded audio, played through even the best speakers, can capture the visceral terror of knowing that death could arrive at any instant, with no warning, no chance to fight back, no possibility of escape. The veterans who survived the Bulge carried their memories in different ways. Some spoke freely about their experiences, giving interviews and writing memoirs, trying to ensure that future generations would understand what had happened in those frozen forests. Others remained silent, unable or unwilling to put into words what they had seen and done. But nearly all of them, when asked about the most terrifying aspect of the battle, mentioned the artillery. Not the cold, not the surprise attack, not the fear of capture or death. The artillery, the endless, merciless thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that could find you no matter where you hid, that represented a kind of warfare that felt somehow wrong, somehow unfair, even in the midst of a conflict where fairness had ceased to have any meaning. And the technology continued to evolve. The lessons learned in the Bulge were immediately applied to operations in the final months of the European War. American artillery became even more lethal, even more responsive, even more integrated with air power and armor and infantry. By the time of the Rhine crossings in March 1945, American fire support had reached a level of sophistication that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years earlier. Forward observers could call down fire from multiple battalions simultaneously. Aircraft could request artillery to suppress anti-aircraft positions in real time. Commanders could shape the battlefield using fire support in ways that minimized friendly casualties while maximizing enemy losses. The atomic bombs that ended the war against Japan in August 1945 represented, in many ways, the logical conclusion of the artillery revolution that had begun in the Ardennes. Here was the ultimate expression of the philosophy that the Battle of the Bulge had proven, that the side with the ability to deliver overwhelming firepower onto a target would win, regardless of the enemy's courage or skill or determination. The bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki were simply artillery shells writ large, carried by bombers instead of fired from guns, but embodying the same principle, that industrial power and scientific knowledge, properly applied, could end wars through the sheer magnitude of destruction they could unleash. In the decades since World War II, artillery has continued to evolve in ways that would have amazed the gunners of 1944. Modern self-propelled howitzers can fire and displace within minutes, making them nearly immune to counter-battery fire. Rocket artillery can deliver cluster munitions or guided warheads across dozens of miles. Naval guns can fire GPS-guided projectiles that land within meters of their aim point, even at extreme range. Missiles have blurred the line between artillery and air power, with systems like the Army Tactical Missile System capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away with devastating accuracy. But for all the technological advancement, for all the improvements in range and accuracy and lethality, the fundamental philosophy remains unchanged from what was proven in the snow-covered forests of Belgium in December 1944. Artillery wins wars. Not exclusively. Infantry must still hold ground, armor must still break through, aircraft must still control the skies. But artillery makes all of these other missions possible by suppressing enemy forces, destroying their equipment, breaking their will to resist. Every modern military understands this truth, and every modern military has invested billions in maintaining and improving its artillery capabilities. The young men who served those guns in the Ardennes are mostly gone now, claimed by age and time. The last veterans of World War II are in their late 90s or older, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. Soon there will be no one left who remembers the sound of those guns, who can testify from personal experience to the earth-shaking thunder of American artillery at full cry. But the legacy endures in the doctrine manuals that still teach time on target, in the fire direction centers that still use mathematical precision to guide death from the sky, in the endless quest for better, faster, more accurate ways to deliver violence onto target coordinates. And so the guns fell silent in May of 1945, their barrels worn smooth by the passage of millions of shells, their crews exhausted beyond measure by months and years of continuous operations. The factories that had fed them slowed their production, retooled for peacetime goods, tried to forget the singular efficiency with which they had manufactured death. The men who had served them came home, tried to rebuild lives that had been interrupted by war, tried to find meaning in a world that seemed small and quiet after the thunder had stopped. But their legacy thunders on, echoing through every conflict, every battlefield, every moment when men calculate the trajectory of death and pull the lanyard. The artillery of the Bulge proved that there are no limits to how efficiently human beings can kill one another, given the right tools, the right training, and the willingness to transform murder into mathematics. It proved that industrial power, properly applied, can overwhelm any human factor: courage, skill, experience, determination. It proved that in modern warfare, victory belongs not to the bravest, but to the side with more guns, more shells, and better calculations. The snow still falls softly in the Ardennes, drifting through forests that have grown back over the scars, covering the ground where so many died so long ago. But if you listen carefully, in the spaces between the wind, you can still hear it, the ghost of that thunder, the echo of those shells, the memory of a moment when the earth itself trembled beneath the weight of American firepower. And somewhere, in a factory that never stops, in a firing solution that never ages, in a doctrine that has become gospel, the guns are still speaking. They will never stop speaking. That is the true legacy of the artillery, the lesson written in fire across a frozen battlefield 8 decades ago. That once you teach men to kill with such precision, such efficiency, such industrial perfection, the thunder never truly ends. It merely waits, patient and eternal, for the next war, the next winter, the next moment when someone calculates the math of death and whispers into a radio, "Fire for effect." And the shells arc through the sky, trailing their brief bright scars across the darkness, carrying with them the accumulated knowledge of 100 years of artillery science, the product of countless hours of calculation and training and industrial production. They fall upon their targets with the same mathematical certainty that guided them in the Ardennes, killing with the same impersonal efficiency, teaching the same terrible lesson that was learned in the snow and blood of December 1944. That lesson is this: in the modern age, the nation that can best harness its industrial and scientific capabilities for the purposes of war will prevail, regardless of the courage or skill of its enemies. That victory comes not from the hearts of heroes but from the factories of Detroit, not from the battlefield genius of commanders but from the firing tables of mathematicians, not from the rifle in a soldier's hands but from the shells that fall from the sky guided by calculations made miles away. It is a harsh truth, perhaps an uncomfortable one for those who prefer to think of war as a test of character rather than a contest of industrial capacity. But it is a truth nonetheless, proven beyond any doubt in the forests of Belgium, validated by every major conflict since, and certain to remain valid as long as human beings continue to wage war upon one another. The thunder of American artillery in the Battle of the Bulge was not just the sound of one battle being won. It was the sound of warfare itself being transformed, of a new age being born in fire and steel. It was the sound of the future, and that sound echoes still, waiting for the next generation to learn its lessons, to perfect its techniques, to make the killing even more efficient than before. This is the legacy we inherit from those frozen days in December 1944, from the men who served those guns and the men who died beneath their shells. Not glory, not heroism, but something far more powerful and far more terrible. The knowledge of how to transform human beings into target coordinates, courage into casualty statistics, and war into a problem that can be solved with sufficient application of mathematics and steel. The guns are silent now, in the museums and monuments of Belgium. But their voice still echoes across the decades, still shapes how armies think and fight and kill. And it will continue to echo, long after the last veteran has died and the last eyewitness is gone, preserved in doctrine and training and the institutional memory of militaries around the world. Thunder without end. That is what the artillery of World War II created. That is what we remember when we speak of the Battle of the Bulge. Not just a tactical victory or a strategic turning point, but the moment when killing became a science, when war became an industry, when the future revealed itself in the flash of exploding shells and the trembling of the frozen earth beneath the boots of men who would never forget the sound of that terrible, magnificent, utterly impersonal thunder.